Yeah, thank you for joining us today. My name is Randy Karangizi, and I am the host for Local Talks events. Local Talks is a series of events based around green design, architecture, and construction in East Africa. And our aim, the aim of Local Talks is really to create just an open platform for discussions around these topics. It was initiated by Localtalks, which is a design and build practice based in Kampala in 2020. So our first event was held in 2020, and this is our 6th event today. We've had a number of topics discussed from building with earth bags to tropical roofs, and most recently we had a session on e-mobility. And it's been great to see more speakers and more attendees involved, and yeah, we hope to see the platform continue to grow. For anyone who wants to know more, there is information on our website, and also all previous talks are recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. Please note that the event today is being recorded, as they always are, and will be available afterwards for a rewatch. And the session will be split into 3 parts. We will have presentations by speakers, a few panelist statements, and then we'll open up for an open question and answer session. And I guess that brings us to the topic for today, which is titled A Future for the Past, Restore, Redevelop, and Reuse. And this session is based on the topic of preserving architectural heritage in East Africa. And we hope that the title intrigued you and that you are excited to be part of this conversation and to join in with this discussion. We feel that it's an important topic in our context today and look forward to hearing from the presenters and panelists and who we have with us. So the first presentation, there would be, I guess, 2 or 3 presentations, one by Timothy Latim, a photographer and designer based in Kampala, with experience documenting heritage buildings. Then we'll also have Iga Perzyna and Berend who are from African Architecture Matters, and they will be splitting as the second presentation. African Architecture Matters is a non-profit consultancy working on projects within the African built environment, but I'm sure they will share more on this. And then afterwards, we have 2 statements shared by panelists that are Iga Perzyna, who is a CEO for the Dar Center for Architectural Heritage in Tanzania, and then Dr. Kalanda Kamlakan, who is a senior lecturer at the Technical University of Mombasa, and he has extensive experience working in the field of conservation and with the national museums in Kenya. So we're just really thankful to all these presenters and presenters mentioned and the panelists. And we'd also like to acknowledge USA, who has continually supported our events. Just with the presentations, if there are any questions that arise during the conversation, please feel free to put them in the question and answer session, question and answer box, sorry. Or you can also wait till the end and ask the question yourself live. So yeah, so we will keep the questions to the end of the discussion, but yes, feel free to ask and to have those questions ready as we go. I think that's enough from me. I'm just going to hand over to the presenters and we start the discussion. Timothy is first, so I'll just hand over to Timothy. Thank you, Timothy.
Yes, good evening, everybody. Like Randy mentioned, my name is Timothy. I'm an independent photographer and a designer based in Kampala. So I'm going to talk about a very simple idea. The presentation is called 3 by 3. I don't know whether I should, okay. So I'm talk about 3 buildings and 3 ideas why I think the buildings actually have heritage significance and why we should actually look after them. The first building is called Bank of Uganda, and the 3 ideas I'm looking at are the way it handles solar shading, the way they use the interior court, and the way the roof is designed. So Bank of Uganda is the central bank of Uganda, and it was completed around 1970. At the time it was completed, the president was Milton Obote. In 71, Milton Obote was ousted by Idi Amin. Idi Amin then went to reprint banknotes, and it's interesting that on one side of the banknote he has a portrait, and then on the back side is where you actually have the first print of Bank of Uganda. When Idi Amin was overthrown, they did another reprint, and this time they got rid of Idi Amin, but the bank stayed. And since then, the next notes in 82 and 88 have featured the bank, but haven't in any way been portraying any of the presidents. This featuring of the bank has created a kind of like permanence and the status of the bank as a symbol of continuity and stability for the country. What I'm looking at though is the actual building, the actual bank building. There are two, they have a big tower and a small tower. Now, the small tower, which was designed first, has a few elements that it deals with, especially the solar shading, while the big building it deals with the solar shading slightly different. So I'll start with the big tower. The big tower has these protrusions and which read as solid elements, and then it has the actual windows which read as much lighter. This creates a very interesting play of shadows and recesses forward and backwards. And when you look at it, perhaps around the midday sun, when the direct sun is on it, you get a much more pronounced solar shade. While the big tower is designed with that in mind, the smaller tower uses a slightly different strategy. They separate the facade from the building, and the exterior facade is comprised of a solar shade. The solar shade creates a deep shadow between the fenestration and the exterior of the building. That screen, that solar facade, changes between the southern facing facade and the eastern facing facade. On the south side, you have bigger openings between the louvers or the shades, while on the eastern side, you have much tighter space between the louvers and the shades. This creates a fascinating, again, the shadow line between the actual glazing line of the building and the outside. The glazing line becomes almost hidden, so people can't see what is happening inside the space. This creates almost the illusion that of almost a transparent bank, but transparent only because you can see, only because the people from inside the building can see what is happening outside. It also helps reducing direct radiation into the building. If there are any kind of glare and any kind of reflections, it also reduces those. Then when you look at the way the facades are made towards the corners, here there's a bit of a simple, almost a simple recessed gap, and the corner is like almost made invisible, like it's slightly cut off between in the building. So when you're inside the building, you can see everything that is going on around you, but people outside the building cannot see what is happening inside. This is because of the way that solar shade has been designed. The second aspect about the building is the interior courtyard space. The building is completely square, and on the inside, it's interesting that there's a perfect circle. Now, what happens where between the corners of the building and the circle is there's a slightly bigger space which lends for almost people to stop and engage and talk. The circle also creates this interesting interplay between the top level, which is the roof, and the first level. You can't see the ground level from this particular point. They also use the court to bring in light, and it is also used to bring in air. Because of this, all the offices around the building get natural ventilation and natural light. They don't need, or they don't actually use a lot of AC within the building. When you look up to the top, the roof has an interesting skylight that is what filters the light into the space. And when you look down into the skylight, just on the first level, which is above the ground, it terminates on a water feature. Then the third aspect is the roof. The roof level it's one of those spaces that you never get to experience because central bank is completely closed off. But the design is very interesting. They recessed all the structural members and they have a huge overhang. So when you look at the building from outside, it appears like the roof is floating. There's almost nothing holding it. Now, because of the size of the overhang and the space towards the inner courtyard, it is completely open. So air moves freely from the top, air and light move freely from the top up to the ground level, up to the water feature. And then around the water feature, they also use translucent sheets to let light into the ground level. Yeah. Now, the second building I'm going to talk about is called UDET House. And the three aspects here, again, I want to talk about are the way it works with the curves. There's a small series of curves that the building was designed with. There's a stairwell and the horizontal overhangs that they use for different purposes. So UDET House is located on the corner. It's in a corner plot, and in that corner they use the curve to soften the edge. So the curve faces the actual corner of the building. Like it faces the corner plot of the building. So they use the curve to soften the edge and also to pronounce how to get into the building or the building entrance. There's an interesting geometry between the angular lines from the previous, from the back of the building, which come in, meet this curve, and then from the left, meet the curve, and then again, it folds out to go to the right. This was a typical building done in the modern era, and it is something that you can find. It's a bit colonial, typical colonial modern building. Now, the curved entrance is quite interesting because when the overhangs are used to almost compress, when you're moving through the space, it feels a bit narrow until you get past the overhang, and then the space kind of widens up. It also helps create a vista when you're looking outside towards the space. So the space feels much bigger than it would otherwise feel. Then the second aspect is the stairwell. and the stairwell begins from the roof terrace. So to the left is the access to the stairwell. When you get in and you look down into the space, the staircase is designed to almost having quarter landings. So from the top, you get a visual, you can see what's happening on the ground level. And every subsequent landing space is actually visible. Then it was designed, and this allows, on the ground level, it allows for there to be a bit of space. It's a generous landing space on the ground level, which when you look up, there's also, again, another interesting linkage between all the levels that transcend in the building. Then each and every one of the landings was designed with a window at a decent eye level. So not only are you linking to the building vertically, you're also able to look and see what is happening outside the space at each and every subsequent landing space. So when you look at these windows from outside, they look like they're actually randomly placed, and yet the relationship is with the interior space. Then on the landings, on the curved edge of the space, they use the windows, one, to accentuate the views, and then to bring in a lot of light. And finally, they also use them to get air in, to circulate air into the space. So the stairwell is acting almost as an air channel to the rest of the building, with, as usual, the heights of the windows specifically chosen so that somebody who's standing there, who is resting there, can look outside and see something, or can at least enjoy a visual glimpse of what is going on outside. The contrast between the material of the actual steps and the railing form an interesting visual pattern. So if you have any kind of visual handicap, the original stairs where they have the nosing would be able to at least help identify to move from one level to the next. What's also interesting is the choice of where they put the windows, and in this case, on the first level. When you approach it, you move into almost, it's like a light at the end of a tunnel situation, as opposed to having you looking into a straight wall. Having a window at the end of the hallway brings light towards, brings a lot more light into the space. So the transition from a light-filled stairwell into a hallway, then into another room, it's visually stimulating. The building has been repurposed to serve as offices, and the corner office, I think, is by far the most fascinating, because they allow for, there's a lot of cross ventilation between the different, from the door to the window and between the windows themselves. Now, the third aspect is the overhangs. So as I spoke earlier, they were used to define the entrance and to create this threshold between getting out and getting in. But they're also used now for shading of the particular fenestrations of the building, the windows especially. They used also to create these levels. So you see the ground, you see the first level, and see the roof level. Then looking at the building from the other side, which is a lot more plain, the fenestration, the overhangs are used mainly for solar protection. Now, there's what was once the garage, Tuka garage, the building was a residence, has been converted by an architect's office into a studio. It's a fairly small studio, maybe about 25, maybe 50 square meters. So the space has been partitioned. And what I found fascinating about this is the interiors, how they began to get elements from what was already existing. In this case, it is the horizontal overhang to begin to subtly define the interior space. So between the work areas and the movement areas, they use the ceiling or the above overhead level to just subtly define, this is a space where you can work, to introduce light as well. And this is a space where you can move. The idea is very similar, but the detail is a little bit more refined, and that's working with contemporary materials or working with the materials that they chose to use for this particular project. It is also used in the same subtle way in the boardroom. So you have this horizontal step that eventually pronounces what the most important space is around the building, which in this case is supposed to be the table, the meeting table, a round table where you have these interesting discussions. And now the third building is the FES building. And this also has three aspects that I looked at quickly. The first is the courtyard, which is defined by this floating beam. The second is the use of color, in this case blue. And the third is there's an indoor-outdoor connection that you experience in the public spaces of the building. So the building is approached from a long driveway. If you're walking, it will take you about maybe 2 minutes or a minute. And when you get towards the end of the driveway and you turn to your left, that is when you actually experience the entire building. It's blending quite well with the landscape and with the vegetation around. So you don't experience the entirety, you just get a few snippets of what is happening around it. Now, the approach to the entrance is where you begin to actually appreciate where you appreciate the building. So there's this beam that separates what is outside, completely outside, what is the courtyard, or what is this forecourt, this entrance court, and then eventually what is the rest of the building, what is inside the building. Now, this is the forecourt. Directly in front of you, you see the reception. To your right, you see meeting spaces. Then to the left are the more private offices. So this space serves almost as a connection, as a linkage between all the different aspects of the building. It's more pronounced when you go to the top level, and seeing the beam there defines exactly where the building ends and where outside the landscape begins. So you have almost 3 levels. You have back, you have the solid part of the building, then you have this line that says, okay, this is where the building threshold starts, and then this is outside the rest of the building. The second aspect is the use of color, blue, which here is also another thread that ties the entirety or ties the entire building together. It's also used to define the subtle levels. So it's a 2-level building. You can see the first level, the second level, and the roof level above. And it also highlights which are the main elements of the building. In some cases, they're structural. In some cases, they're just shading. It serves as an interesting visual contrast for materials, especially. So everything that was hard and textured is painted over white, while everything that was smooth and easily tactile is painted blue. So this thread continues throughout the space. The effect of which is it can also serve almost as to create visual illusions. So on one side, you see what it would be like if it were entirely one color, which is white. You see how the elements are interacting. You have this thick beam, and then you have the balustrade. Then when you look at the image on the right side, it is almost like the balustrade has disappeared between the two blue lines. Again, more pronounced here, if the entire building had been painted white, the thread wouldn't have been as apparent as when you look at it being painted blue. Now, the third aspect is the indoor to outdoor connection. Once you get into the reception, you can still look into the court, and then from the court, you can still see past into the garden of the space. The same relationship happens in the meeting rooms, which is a much more fluid connection, because the doors at the extreme end completely open out. So this space can ideally become one extended space with a garden space. So while this fluidity is happening and this connection is between indoor and outdoor, the glazing also now serves almost as a disconnect, because when the indoor spaces are darker, you cannot see what is going on. You only get to glimpse reflections of what is happening outside, and you get just specific snippets, but you don't get a full picture, which serves as an interesting privacy mechanism that they can use for the building. Yes, that is it. Thank you. And thanks to these people for helping me. Yeah. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Timothy. That is all really interesting to hear and to see those three buildings that are all within Kampala currently. And I guess Timothy is setting the scene for us and showing us essentially examples of architectural heritage that are in Kampala or in Uganda. I think we'll just move on to the next presentation and then open up for questions later, as I said in the introduction. But if a reminder, if people do have questions, feel free to leave them in the box now. So yeah, I'll hand over to Iga and then Berend next.
Hello, my name is Iga, and as Randy mentioned before, I work with African Architecture Matters. I'm an architectural historian that basically, going from theory, has turned into practice by working with projects that are related to heritage and urban planning, as well as developing of planning policies and other strategies that are related to the conservation and preservation of buildings. And this sort of ties a little bit with the presentation that I'm going to make, because Timothy's presentation was really beautiful and very interesting and inspiring, while the one that I will give will certainly be more informative and straight to the point. Let me share my screen with you. 1 second. Okay, great. Can you hear me? Okay. So the title of the presentation is A Future for the Past, Ways of Preserving Built Heritage. And it is a presentation that will be given jointly, but also a little bit separately by me and Berend van der Lans, my colleague from African Architecture Matters. Preservation of built heritage takes place on different levels. There is the level of the city when planning policies come into play, and the issue at stake may be, how can you protect buildings when the decision makers and the broader public are not aware of their significance? And there is the level of the individual buildings when other questions might apply, such as, how can you ensure that the decisions you make with regard to your heritage building will secure its integrity and significance in the future? Or how do you prevent an old building from becoming redundant or financially burdensome? What we would like to do in this presentation is to provide you with some possible answers to these questions. In order to do that, we would like to use examples from projects that we have worked on recently. For the sake of clarity, we have divided the presentation into two parts. The first part will be concerned with tools and strategies at hand when it comes to influencing planning policies and the long and short-term management of buildings, question 1 and 2. Here I will use mapping and conservation management plans respectively as examples. In the second, Berend will present you with a business model that puts social and financial sustainability of heritage buildings at its core, question 3. Before I start, I will just like to add that I'm aware that we have given ourselves a rather ambitious task for such a short presentation. But what we would like to do in the end is, and we hope to achieve, is to give you some food for thought and provide input for the following conversation. So please bear with us. To start with, I would like to say a few words on mapping. In general, mapping is a methodological tool that can be applied in different contexts and for different purposes. The mapping I will shortly discuss is known as cultural mapping, which is commonly used in participatory planning. In general, it aims to make visible tangible and intangible cultural assets within local landscapes. Cultural mapping can take the form of an inventory approach to the left, as well as an integrated approach that assumes a direct involvement of various stakeholders in the process of mapping, both of which we applied in our work. In 2015, AA Matters was approached by the Department of Urban and Rural Planning in Zanzibar to assist in the preparation of the local area plan for the new city center of Zanzibar town. It was a project that had its roots in a long-standing collaboration between the city of Amsterdam and the government of Zanzibar. And the overall aim of the collaboration was to develop policies and instruments for heritage-based regeneration in Zanzibar. To provide you with a little bit of a background, the area designated as the new city center of Zanzibar town, commonly known as Nambo, lies just outside of Stone Town. Stone Town is to the left and Nambo is to the right, black. Sorry. Yeah, just outside of Stone Town. In broad strokes, despite its over 100 years long history, Nambo has in general been regarded part of the city with no cultural and no historical importance. This perception, shared both by the local and international community, has resulted in the lack of appreciation for the role Nambo has played in the shaping of the urban landscape of Zanzibar's capital. In terms of architecture, where the buildings of Stone Town have received a lot of attention over the years, resulting among others in the designation of Stone Town as a World Heritage Site, the architecture of Nambo has largely been dismissed as uninteresting and not worthy of preservation in any capacity. Together with the Department of Urban and Rural Planning, AA Matters was responsible for out a research on Nambo with the overall objective of identifying its urban heritage values, which would later be integrated into the local area plan. The first thing we set out to do was to conduct an extensive inventory of the existing building stock. In total, we mapped around 5,000 buildings, which were assigned the following categories: typology, style, condition, building technique, and roof structure. The straightforward mapping of the buildings provided us, on the one hand, with an up-to-date image of the character and condition of the buildings in the area. But on the other hand, And more importantly for this presentation, it enabled us to make a first broad selection of buildings that we deemed of architectural interest or significance. In the next stage of the project, we went to the field in order to understand what are the intangible values that people attach to the environment that they live in. While mapping of buildings could be conducted by a small group of professionals, mapping of the intangible relied heavily on the local community. As a part of the process, we conducted numerous walks across the area with various informants that were encouraged to share stories about their environments. The walks were recorded on maps with annotations. We also conducted a number of informal and formal interviews, which often resulted in additional information on elements that were already identified as important by the informants during the walks that we had. As in the case of the tangibles, the findings of the intangible mapping were also translated into maps, such as places of cultural activities or social interaction, which are presented both here. In the next stage, in the next stage, we cross-reference the information we gathered through the mapping of the tangible and intangible environment. The end result was a list of sites of special interest informed not only by the architectural interest that guided our initial selection, but also by the historical and communal importance identified by the people. In short, it provided a glimpse of the cultural richness of the area as manifested in its built environment. Mapping was one of the tools that were employed in the process of trying to understand the historical and cultural landscape of Namibia. The results of the process were translated and incorporated into the final planning document that was adopted for implementation by the government of Zanzibar in 2016. A planning document in itself does not guarantee that the proposed buildings will be protected, but in the end, the mapping enabled us to identify sites of special interest, and by this also show that the area merits more attention from the decision makers when it comes to valuing its built environment while making decisions about its future. The conservation management plan for the Uganda National Museum. And this is where we bring the subject back home to you guys sitting in Kampala. So the Uganda National Museum is one of the first purpose-built museums in Africa and one of the first modernist buildings in Kampala. It was designed by the German architect Ernst May and built in 1954. Since then, it has held its door open for the public. In 2018, the museum was awarded the Keeping It Modern grant by the Goethe Foundation. The main objective of the grant was to support the creation of a CMP, which is a conservation management plan. A conservation management plan is a document that helps to develop a management strategy for a heritage building. It explains the significance of an asset and examines how any future use, management, alteration, or repair should be carried out in order to retain that significance. In essence, it can be said that it touches upon the past, present, and the future of the building. In the case of the Uganda Museum, the team was presented with a building that has undergone multiple alterations over time, resulting, among others, in new additions to the original design of Ernst A, which you can see here. The original design is kind of the spine of the building, more or less. It was also a building that requires structural repair due to endured weather damage, general wear and tear of building materials, and a periodical lack of maintenance. And last but not least, it is a building that maintains its original use and serves the local community as well as the international community as a living and growing institution open to the public and dedicated to education. In general, I would say that the easy way to understand what the work on a CMP entails is to picture it as a series of actions taken in order to properly understand the building, assess its significance, both cultural and architectural, but also social, and explore relevant issues. The process ends with setting policy aims and goals. In the case of this project, I will discuss very briefly through actions that AA Matters was involved in, and then mention two other actions that were also conducted, but we weren't really a part of that. The first one is historical analysis and exploratory investigation of the building. Maybe I can say a little bit more what it entailed, because historical analysis generally is this bigger concept that entails archival research into any available material that you really have about the building that you are working with. And that could go as far as oral history, I would even argue, but the most traditional documents or materials you would consult are old reports or any available literature on the building or photographic documentation. But basically the historical analysis and the exploratory investigation of the building enabled us to define the major alterations to the respective parts of the building. We were also able to kind of identify the significance of each of the parts and assess their overall architectural and cultural and and assess their contribution to the overall architectural, cultural, and historical value of the museum. And the map that you are looking at is a bit of a representation of the historical analysis combined with the exploratory investigations. And basically we were conducting workshops where we kind of discussed each of the parts of the building that is presented here and try to sort of assess their respective significance and identify elements in the buildings that we knew or thought or suspected were authentic, and the same goes for things that we knew or thought or suspected that were, for instance, inauthentic. The other action that we were also involved in was condition assessment, which is basically a broad tool or a broad set of kind of activities that you undertake in order to sort of investigate the condition of the building, to understand the physical state of its components and as well as services, and to assess the overall maintenance need. In addition, because the building is a museum, special attention was also devoted to the museum collection, and there is a separate section on that in the CMP. As well as its current management. So some diagrams. The information gathered through the activities undertaken by the team resulted in a set of goals that intend to support the long-term vision for the museum. These goals, as you can see, include strengthen management of the museum, 2, improve conservation of the building and its environment, 3, prepare for disasters, mitigate risks, 4, enhance visitation, public awareness, community involvement. But nearing the end, what I think is perhaps the most practical embodiment of the CMP can be found in the action plan that was drawn for each of the goals, or the matrix that was created within the action plan, which you can see here. The action plan defines the objectives as well as tasks that need to be taken in order to meet them. It also gives the task a deadline, which is always a very good motivator to act. And I would say that what it really does, it turns words into action, and by doing, as well as providing a tool for verification of a progress. So basically by setting out to doing this matrix, which is influenced by all the information you have collected throughout the process of creating the CMP, you really know that you kind of target the issues or the challenges that arise or are kind of concerned with the building and need to kind of be addressed in one way or another. Okay, so as of today, the CMP is still in its final stages of revision. The document will be available for download from the Getty website in the future. And I guess my final remark would be that apart from being a short and long-term management tool, the CMPs are also a very valuable record and source of information on heritage buildings in general. So for anyone who's interested in architecture, I would strongly recommend to look into various CMPs because there is a lot of interesting stuff that can be found there. Thank you very much. Berend? Yes.
Yes, can you see me and hear me? Just to add on the last slide, of course, it was definitely not a project done by us alone, and actually most of the work is done by others. If you look at the report, you can understand that, and the list that was shown at the last slide was giving an insight in the museum team, Dorina Dengo with her team, Rand Eppich had a very important role in bringing everything together, and then we were also involved. I'm going to share my screen now.
Yes. I was. I did kind of present that the entire team to make clear that the role of AA Matters was. Well, I don't want to say marginal, but we weren't the only ones working on the CMP. So yes, your turn, Berend. Thank you.
Okay, share. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about a model for investment and management of historical buildings. It's definitely not a model that can be used everywhere, but it gives some insight in what could be possible. It is a model that is tested in Amsterdam since the 1950s, and we have been helping to implement in Zanzibar, and I will then dive into a kind of a project case. But let's start in Amsterdam. Amsterdam is, as you may know, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, or at least part of it, and that is actually the part on this picture, the Amsterdam Canal Zone, and it's beautiful. People like it. It is known for its attractions, especially when the weather is as nice as on these images. Visiting, we attract a lot of tourism, not in the Corona times, of course, but before that, perhaps even too many tourists nowadays, also just before Corona times. But the city is now even looking into measures to limit the numbers. But as you see, it looks quite nice. That was different in the past, however. This is around the 50s of the last century, just after the Second World War. And you see, it's not an attractive city at all, with a lot of problems, with a lot of buildings in very bad conditions. People were moving out of town. People were looking of the city council was also investing in in the residential areas outside of town, because well, this was the city center, and it's not really attractive. People didn't see this as attractive for housing, but they were more thinking like turning it into a central business district or center for commerce and businesses. This is a slide of how this looked like. If you can see, you see this line here, this white line. This is a major breakthrough to really. So this is the historical center, and the historical center is, of course, quite with narrow streets and many narrow streets and small buildings. And well, the city council wanted to make that part ready for the car. Wide roads, metro also drawn in here, and get rid of all the old stuff. This is what they had in mind. So on the left you see the image of the so-called Weesperstraat, a certain actually a certain area. Well, it's actually this one, the one that is white. And on the right, how it looked like several years later when they implemented what they had in mind. However, there was a group of people that were opposing this, and it was they of course did that in through debates and discussions, but they realized that that they were not going to win it through that route. They believed in the value of heritage, in the potential and the importance of inclusive cities, with residential use as a core as well, or at least an important function in the center of town. Some of the people who wanted to do this, who were supporting this, were people with links to capital, and they decided to join forces, start a company, and take action. So what they did is, in this image is one of the first buildings that they started to tackle. This is the situation when they bought the building, and this is what it was after the restoration work. So they bought buildings in a very bad shape, usually on corners, because corners always have more effect. Of course, they have two sides anyway, and they are very much in view. So the impact of their investment would be stronger. And what they did is they were not redeveloping it to sell, but they were keeping it and renting it out. This is not the way I want to go. So step by step, the sizes of the projects grew. Here you see the previous one, you see one building. Now here they bought 3 at a time to become more efficient. And what is important is the shareholders were always, they were received, so it's a profit-making company, but they were receiving a modest dividend. But the majority of the profits that they made were reinvested in new buildings. So they started more or less with one building in 56, and actually 10 years later they had almost 100 buildings in the center of Amsterdam. At that time, you saw the previous pictures. The buildings were not worth a lot because they were in very bad condition. So it was easy to acquire buildings, but of course you still have to invest in them to restore them. So the principle is modest dividend, never sell, but keep the buildings in your capital, because that also helps you in creating more value. And each of the projects need to be viable in itself. So so they on every building they did a calculation, and let's say the profits or the return the returns coming in through the investment should cover the cost of the investment over a certain time, of course. Another scale level step up, as you see, this is actually in the 80s. So here it was like a whole block in the city being redeveloped. On the left, a very problematic area with a lot of addicted people and squatters in these buildings. And later on, it was redeveloped and mainly being made ready for residential use. Around the mid 80s, you could say that this company was kind of finished with their task. The company, I don't know if I mentioned the name. It's called Stadsherstel. It's not easy for non-Dutch speakers, but Stadsherstel literally means city restoration or restoration of cities. But so in the city center, around that time, they had almost 450 buildings, which is quite a large part of the total amount of buildings. And this investment around that time, other people, other house owners, and also housing corporations, etc., of course, already saw the interest in investing in historical property and making it to use, on the one hand for residential use, and on the other hand, because often you see on the ground level, you see commercial use. So around that time, they started shifting to other types of buildings. Buildings that are, let's say, difficult to redevelop, not easy. That could be churches or factories or wharves and defense buildings. Let's say buildings with challenges in finding new functions. This is one of those buildings. This is a church right in the middle of town, in a very bad stage, and the church community was not able to maintain the building anymore. They just couldn't afford it anymore, and they were still having services in the building. This is a few years later. Stadsherstel bought the building, restored it, and has since then their offices in there. And the church space is rented out. On the one hand, the church community can still use it for free on Sunday mornings, or at least when they have their services. On the other hand, there are events in this building for lower price levels for social events. But it's also commercial rental to and this mix of let's say revenue makes sure that this is a viable model in this case. Some examples of activities that take place there. There's this is a concert. Some event, maybe a wedding. There's exhibitions there. It looks like dancing. People get married there. So you see that this is the way that they build up financial sustainable use of a building. Now we move to an example. One other building that is in their ownership in Amsterdam North. This is a building that I worked on also as an architect in Amsterdam. It is a community building and has a large theater hall as a core. So this is the entrance. So you get in, and this is the large hall. And on the left, there's a smaller hall. And on the right, there used to be community spaces. On the top floor, there was, oh no, this is the attic, the basement, but on the top floor, there was also an office. So what happened is they, this of course was used by the neighborhood as well, and this one too, but also there were larger events in it, but it was not a sustainable model anymore. It was owned by the government or by the city of Amsterdam. They rented out these spaces, but there was not enough revenue coming in to keep it afloat. So Stadsherstel bought the building and developed a model that is, this is some images. This is the hall, and this is the one of the office spaces. What they did was the following model. Stadsherstel was the owner. They had agreements with two companies. One is Opus One, the other is Double Two. That is by coincidence, those names. It's just funny. But so with those two companies, they had an agreement on rent of office space, a number of hours use of the theater halls for rehearsal and music registration, because, for instance, Double Two is also producing radio programs. And they have a commitment to program a number of evenings in the theater hall per year. And the rest of the capacity of the theater halls is programmed by Stadsherstel with, for instance, they have a link with Paradiso Amsterdam, which is a concert hall. And since this is another part of Paradiso is in the right in the center, but they also aim to go out to other parts of the city. There are TV program registration, social activities for community groups, seminar, private events, etc. So this is, of course, a mix of revenue. Concert series could be lower price level, but TV program is, of course, expensive, or at least they pay more, etc., etc. So here you see what happens. I don't know why this goes by itself, but this is a TV registration. This is a radio registration, concerts, a presentation or a seminar, dining, theater. This is musical, because one of the two companies is programming musicals, social activities in the smaller hall, and even boxing events, because boxing events, they happened for over a long time in that building. So somehow they want to keep that happening again. So this company, Stadsherstel, first focused on residential development in the city center, later on for these specific models, creative models on how to reuse old historical buildings. There was an interest in Zanzibar for this model, because you can imagine Zanzibar also has this UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they have a lot of old buildings, a government that doesn't have a lot of money to invest in them. They have a private sector that is really depending kind of on that cultural heritage of Zanzibar, the old stone town. So the Zanzibar tourism is really a combination of sand, beaches, and this culture. So the tourism industry could be an interesting party to invest in setting up a similar company. So we started in 2011 to look into the possibilities of that together with a group of people in Zanzibar, investors as well. And 5 years later, we were there to found this company, which then it was called Hifadhi Zanzibar, which in Swahili could be translated as Preserve Zanzibar. Now, it goes too far to really get to detail into the different studies that we did, but quickly we did some quick studies on quick feasibility studies. So we looked at certain buildings that were on the market or perhaps on the market. We had a lot of discussions with many people, but so this is one of those buildings that we quickly measured and did some studies on what the possibilities were. Then we made quick sketches like what is possible, what functions could you add there, and then how can you make this feasible. Now these are very simple calculations. They don't go very deep. It goes too deep too far to get deep into this now, but basically you look into the project development cost. You look at the revenues, you define a certain amount of years in which you want to have the revenues covering the costs, and then you deduct the annual cost, and then you can see if it's feasible or not. Now, at the moment, this is the building that Hifadi owns, you could say. This is, sometimes it's a bit spontaneous, this slideshow. This is the building that they currently own, and currently the top floors are being redeveloped into residential use, while in the courtyard and on the ground floor there are sometimes concerts, and Hifadi's office is based there, and some social activities take place now and then. Now we move into to the directions of Majestic Cinema, which is an old cinema in Stone Town, on the border of Stone Town. It used to be, this is a new building, built in '54, exactly the year of the museum by coincidence. It is designed by a local architect of Indian descent. And it replaced the building designed by Sinclair, who was the resident architect of the British that was built in, I'm not exactly sure, but I thought 1912. But anyway, that burned down in the beginning of the 50s, and this one was built quickly after that. It's a funny building, as you can see. It's a mix of different styles. This is basically you see 1921 the original building was erected, and it played an important role in Zanzibar's culture, and also a social important social node where people came together, etc. You can imagine. This is the interior. It's in a very bad state. You can see it here, but if you go inside, you see that the roof is the ceiling is off, the roof is leaking, well, half open, etc., etc. It's in a very bad state. Plants are growing out, etc. We did some quick measurements. Unfortunately, we still do not have the original drawings, but we did some quick measurements which kind of give a good indication of how the building looks like. And then we did a couple of studies on feasibility. Now this looks very fancy, of course. This is not our work. This is work of students from, I believe, Cape Town University, and also Uganda Martyrs University was involved in a project that we did March last year on several, on let's say the redevelopment studies on the building, adaptive reuse. But at the same time, we worked at ways to make this a feasible model, and that is this is a model that you could use. You have ownership. At the moment, the government of Zanzibar is owning it. The building could be sold to Hifadi Zanzibar. Shareholders of Hifadi are, let's say, co-owning it then as shareholders. And you could see that also the government of Zanzibar could have a shareholder position. Now, not a majority, because that is always the risk. You don't want one party to have a larger role than the other, but they could, for instance, by bringing in the building, obtain a position as shareholder. The management of the building could be in the hands of Ifadi, and then you have tenants or user group. There is currently still a small cinema operator making use of the building. Basically, that is also the guy who does this for a long time, and is even the son of the guy who did it before that. So he is actually part of the, you could say, intangible heritage. So he definitely should have a place in the use of the building. Then there is the organization Zanzibar International Film Festival and Sauti za Busara, two large cultural organizations in Zanzibar who are very keen to become tenant and part of this redevelopment. And you can understand that for them, it's the same as in this building in the Netherlands. You can make agreements on the rent of office space, the use of the cinema hall, and it's not only cinema, but you can also use it as concert hall, etc. So you can organize a similar kind of agreement. And then there's another organization called Reclaim Women's Space, who can also make use of offices and also events related to what they do. And the rest of the time, Hifadi Zanzibar can organize bookings and rental for either commercial or social rent of the space. And next to that, you can imagine there can be a cafe restaurant to make it more sustainable. Last year, or 2 years ago, we were successful in applying for a grant through the Culture at Work program. And through this Culture of Work program, we have developed this model further. And now we are a step further. There's even a website called Majestic Culture Hub, I think, .co.tz or majestichub.co.tz. Of course, this ownership, you can also, so this part you can also, so this is selling it, but there are also other ways of ownership. So you could lease on short term, you can lease long term. Of course, these all have implementations on the rate of return of the. Anyway, so financial sustainability of these kind of projects. There's the cost side, which includes the restoration cost, the building acquisition and additional costs, consultants, taxes and fees. So that brings the total cost, and then you have the revenue side, revenues from all the functions, minus maintenance and management costs, total net revenue. And that needs to be seen in relationship to the internal rate of return, which is like the length you will look at when you to decide if it's viable or not. The factors of influence on this is, of course, the ownership status, either ownership or lease, mix of functions, restoration ambitions, because you can also decide to be less ambitious in your restoration, so make it safe and make it usable, but don't make it with golden taps, for instance. And the phased approach, which you can also use, like first doing one part or one ambition level, and the next time you do another ambition level. So this is how where you can play with. And I'm afraid I don't have a nice final slide. So this is what I wanted to share with you. And maybe I took too long. And who is taking over?
Sorry, I think sorry, you have one more slide you'd wanted to conclude? Or that's okay.
Did you no, I said I don't have a nice finishing slide.
Oh, sorry. I
it's just a
misheard
a
you.
boring black screen. Sorry
I
about that.
misheard. Okay. Thank you both Iga and Berend for your presentations. I think we'll just move quite quickly into the panelist statements so that there's a bit of time for attendees to ask questions. So I think I'll hand over to Calendar first. If you could just give us a short statement on the session today, and essentially if there are a few questions you'd like to raise as well, please go ahead and do that.
Okay, thank you, Randy. I hope I can be heard. Thank you very much for 3 excellent presentations. I'm not talking here as an expert, but I'm also learning a lot. In the interest of time, I think I'll just shorten my statements. Very quickly, the presentation by Timothy, you said you're a photographer, but you talk like an architect and a city planner with very nice photographs of buildings. Most of the buildings, the 3 buildings that you talked 3 by 3, Bank of India, UDET House, and Fes Building, those were built, I think, the 20th century. And then very quickly, when we got to Iga's presentation, it was more about history, Zanzibar, and also modern building, the Uganda National Museum. And Berend, the same, I think it was mostly it was about, yes, history and modern building. I know UNESCO right now is working on defining modernity in Africa. What is modernity? Modernity in the Eurocentric sense is related to progress. It's related to let's say a period after the Industrial Revolution. But where did modernity start in Africa? When I was working with the National Museums of Kenya, my interest was more in buildings ranging from let's say 7th century to 19th century. I wasn't so much interested in modern buildings. But after some time, when I became mature, I started looking at buildings that were built in 20th century, and we managed to gazette during my time. I think the highest percentage of buildings, about 30 buildings that were built in 20th century. Gazettement means protection. We can never discard issues of colonization in terms of our modernity, but there are also other aspects when you look at modernity in African culture or in African architecture, issues of typologies of buildings, size of buildings, usage, building materials, change of building materials. So I see a lot of historicity in these presentations and a lot of modernity. One thing many things I learned today, but probably Berend, this is directed to you. When I worked with the National Museums of Kenya, I think I restored over 50 houses in the historic town of Lamu and about 25 buildings. We tried a lot to look at the economic, social aspects, and one of the failures, that we went through is we could not revitalize the economy of the historic towns of Lamu and the historic town of Mombasa, basically because of financing and many issues. And I see you have a very nice model for investment, the Zanzibar, and I'll probably come back to you later on this. How do we revamp? Conservation is not about preserving buildings only, but it's also about revitalizing the economy. It's about enriching the owners of the buildings to make sure that they take care of the buildings. Restoring Zanzibar, it's about social aspect. It's about education. It's about economy. Many things are involved there. It is more complicated than probably restoring the Uganda National Museum, a building. So there are many aspects that that are involved in restoring or taking care of a town like Zanzibar, which is our UNESCO World Heritage Site. Lamu, by the way, is also a World Heritage Site. There are many issues. So in the interest of time, as I said, these were very excellent presentations. I learned a lot, and maybe I can, and one thing I wanted to also say, I've not mentioned Iga. Iga, I know she talked about cultural mapping, and we went through some of these processes, like the historic urban landscape. I think it was done by a Dutch who passed away, Van de Oos, if I remember his name. Yeah.
Koen van Oers, yeah.
Van de Oos, yeah. He did something in Zanzibar, I think in Mozambique, and then also in Lamu. So we went through this, and I don't know why this was discarded after his death, or maybe it's still continuing, but it's something that happened in Ngambo in Zanzibar, and the Mji Mkongwe of Zanzibar. So this is, as I said, the excellent presentations, and in the interest of time, maybe I can hand over back to you, Randy, for further instruction.
Yeah. Thank you for your comments, Calendar. And yeah, I think I will hand over straight to Ida, who is here with us as well.
Yes, thank you. I would also like to thank all the presenters on the excellent presentations. I will probably just give a few examples of what we have tried to do here in Dar es Salaam in particular. I work for an organization that's called DARCH, which stands for the Dar Center for Architectural Heritage. And it was an organization that was formed through a coalition of different institutions that got together when they basically felt there was a need for an intervention because we were losing a lot of our historical buildings in the city center, specifically Dar es Salaam. So obviously, countrywide, we do have different buildings that have a lot of architectural value. And our architectural heritage is a mixed heritage. It comprises of buildings that were built by the Omani Sultanate through to the Germans and then the British. And then of course we have our own modernistic architects who built various buildings right up to the 60s, right up to the 80s. So now DARCH was formed with higher learning institutions, 2 universities. One is an architecture university here in Dar es Salaam. Another one is TU Berlin, which is based in Germany, as well as the Goethe Institute and the Architectural Association of Tanzania. And the plan was to really raise awareness on the importance of conservation and protection of historical monuments. And the monuments, basically, as much as we're called architectural, an organization that's trying to preserve architectural heritage, we really look at buildings, open spaces, as well as monuments. So these organizations felt there was a need for an intervention because we were losing a lot of the buildings. So in 2014, they got together and formed DARCH. Currently, DARCH is still existing, but I can say there are a lot of challenges in terms of the area around the political will, I can say, from government and from the community. DARCH actually saw there was the only way that DARCH was able to be formed was through the funding from the EU. So already it needed almost an outside force to bring this organization to life. So I think a lot of our African cities do face this challenge of this kind of initiative not being pushed from inward. And by inward, I mean through government political will and through community political will. So we were able to restore one building and this building is actually the oldest building in Dar es Salaam. It's called the Old Boma, where the offices of Dutch are currently housed. And the idea was to have a model building to basically show that it's possible, it can be done, and to actually have a tangible example of how it was done. Realistically speaking, of course, it's a very expensive venture. And I think this is why a lot of the government and a lot of the historical buildings in Dar es Salaam are government owned, either through the municipalities or through the national housing corporations. So one of the presenters said, one of the challenges is when you have a historical building that's owned by an institution that's not necessarily concerned or prioritizing the heritage aspect of the building. Most of the time, if there's work that needs to be done, we are looking for the cheapest and the shortest way of doing it. We're not necessarily focusing on, are we trying to preserve the architectural or heritage element of it? So this is a constant challenge, and of course it is an expensive enterprise, but I think with the right political will, we can get there. So this is partly what we're trying to do at DARJ. We're trying to raise awareness so that we can get the government buy-in, we can also get the community buy-in. Government alone cannot do it. We're hoping we can get some interested individuals who would be moved enough to want to put their financing in basically restoring these buildings and maintaining their heritage aspect. One of the presenters also said that one of the best ways in which to preserve these buildings is to make them community-based. I completely agree with that. I think when you have a certain amount of foot traffic and a certain amount of connection with the community, then there's a sense of ownership that takes place eventually. I will give you an example. Here in Dar es Salaam, we have two of the oldest churches that were built in the 1890s. One is a Catholic church and one is a Lutheran church. They were the first churches to be built by the German colonial administration. Till today, these buildings remain in pristine condition because they're in use. They're in use, they're places of worship. So there is a sense of care that's always taking place. It's not the same with a lot of the buildings where, because it's such an expensive exercise, some are left to just crumble and die because the space is more valuable than trying to actually restore the building. So we're seeing that happening in some of the buildings here in Dar es Salaam. We're seeing that happening in some of the buildings in Zanzibar. And it's a pity. I just wish we would get to a point where the value is what takes precedence and not so much the focus on the cost and maybe the value of the square meters of what could be replaced if that building was not there. So for the interests of time, I think maybe I'll just stop here unless there's some very specific questions I can address. I give the mic back to you, Randy.
All right. Thank you, Ida. I think it's been interesting to hear, the additional comments from really Mombasa and Dar es Salaam, and just bring this, widen our picture of heritage in East Africa. I think now is really a time just to open up question and answer. So if attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the Q&A box, and then these will be directed to the panelists and to all the panelists. Yep, I think I can start. Oh, sorry, I saw a hand. Yeah, I'll just start with some of the questions that I guess we can all see. One of the first questions here is asking about the council. I guess, what is the role of the council with preserving heritage in modern architecture? So I guess maybe this is directed towards Berend more. Yeah.
My question is, what is meant by the council? Is that the city council?
I assume this is the city council.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because then like what I try to present is that basically the initiative that I presented was even more like a private initiative. And that also links to what Aida was saying, that the ownership, let's say community ownership or people investing, that's more important even than that there's but as long as they have the heart in the right, or they have the right ideas about the building. But the value of a building is more in its use than in its physical presence, I would say. That, like, for instance, this old cinema in Zanzibar, of course, it needs to be fixed in a certain way because currently it's even dangerous to go inside. But if it's going to be used, that's of more value than that it is going to be restored in exactly the right way, I would say. Of course, you need to take into account certain aspects, like, for instance, look at the Uganda Museum. The fact that it is a living museum and that people are coming and visiting it and are using it and using the hall at the front for all kinds of events, that makes the building more alive than if we restore it exactly to the original state. So in that sense, does the council play a role? I think a council should be supportive, and if possible, I mean, it also depends on, like, of course, in Amsterdam it's a bit different. It's easier for us there are more kinds of subsidies that you can find, etc., etc. But basically, a council is there to help you. It should be there to help you, but private initiative often ignites the reuse of a building, I would say. Is that a bit of an answer? So how can
I think so.
Persuade the local?
Yeah.
No.
Okay,
I leave it to you, Randy, to agree if I answered it.
No, I think you've answered the question. I think the question could be directed to the Kampala City Council, maybe, and as well, it can be it essentially can be a wider question. But I will move on to a different question about, which is quite interesting. How exactly do we choose which buildings are of heritage value or not? And I think maybe I'm directing this slightly to Iga, maybe because of your presentation about your process of mapping and identifying the spaces of particular value. I guess, I don't know if you'd have anything to comment on this. But why would we choose one building over another, one space over another? You're on mute.
It's a bit of a difficult question because of course it depends what type of buildings we are looking at. But I think when you designate a building as a monument, for instance, then you will have a set of kind of, what is the word in English? Like a list of boxes that you need to tick in order to be a monument, right? So they're let's say on a little bit higher level of, not planning policies, but more like legal level. This is not a very straightforward process, but it is a kind of like a process where you already have, certain boxes that you need to tick. In terms of, for instance, the mapping that we were doing, because why did we decide that one building had heritage significance, or we kind of indicated it as a site of special interest, which was the term that we used, and another one didn't have. Now, this was really based on what I kind of also tried to explain, like this overlapping of certain values that we identified through the whole mapping kind of exercise that we did. Of course, when we were looking at buildings as, let's say, people from coming from architecture, we look at them through the lens of its architecture, and we are able to kind of assess its aesthetic value, its historical value, how old it is, or how good designed it is, or whether it has any features that make it, you know, super interesting, and etc. But that in itself doesn't really, in my opinion, suffice, because as you do the mapping, you kind of really need to involve exactly the social aspect of those buildings. And that's really the defining element for us when we make the final selection. Because truth being said, if we only looked at how the buildings look, then in Nambo, for instance, you will find a ton of fantastic Art Deco, modernist buildings, and etc. But these are like not necessarily buildings that will have a particular value for the entire society or for the community living around. Whereas the buildings that we were able to identify were, for instance, used as dance halls in the past, or used for another cultural activity, and etc. So that sort of was one of the keys, at least in the work that we did, of making that rough first selection and deciding to pick that building instead of that, if that answers the question.
Can I add a little bit on that? Because it's important to say when we talk about we, it's a bigger team. It's not us. It's the Department of Urban and Rural Planning in Zanzibar was deeply involved. We had a big team, and it was not us defining this, but it was always a discussion amongst a larger team, and that defined it. And I think it's important to stress that it's not done by a few people, but it's a team, just like with.
Sorry, I always say we because I just find it easier for the sake of conversation. But behind the we,
yeah, but it's
a team that is.
But the we is a good thing because we feel like we were a group, but it's good to just add this extra layer of information, I think.
Absolutely. But then it's also very interesting that you brought in the fact that it was indeed selected by people with different concepts, for instance, of what is aesthetically pleasing, which is a very interesting kind of element. And then there was certainly, and the first kind of like talks, we did differ, let's say, in our opinions from some of our colleagues at the department who would perhaps look towards more, well, not even modernist buildings, but even beyond that, they would define buildings that were kind of hyper-modern as interesting and of special significance for that. So that's also kind of, it shows how differently those buildings can be perceived.
Okay. If any of the other panelists wants to say anything, please do. I'm just going to allow James to talk to ask his question. Another question. Yeah, there we go.
Hi, everyone. My question is about whether architecture heritage encompasses building techniques. If it does, would it then be honest to use a different kind of building methodology as opposed to the one that was used to build the actual building if the techniques were lost to history? Like, I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah. Maybe, would you like to direct it to anyone in particular? Or it's open.
I think it's an open question.
Okay.
Maybe I can say something about it. Of course, building technique is also part of it. So definitely it needs to be taken into consideration. However, sometimes you, especially with, I mean, if the future of a building cannot be saved by restoring it exactly to the original, then I think you have to take into consideration that sometimes you need to make use of other techniques. And for instance, I'm working on a building in Amsterdam, restoring a building, and the original architect of almost 100 years ago, some of his details were simply not functional. So if we would keep it exactly like that, we would make more damage to the building. So sometimes you need to progress. So it is like doing restoration work is always taking a lot of aspects into consideration, and then make your choices in a very motivated way. And as long as you can really, an important thing is do as less damage to the original as possible, but to also take the future into account. And it's always something, I mean, you always have to make choices, and there's always people who think you make the wrong choice, and others praise you. So it's yeah, I mean, it's you have to be brave. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In your choices.
Thank you. Thank you, James.
Is that answering the question?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to hand over to Felix.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point and essentially widen James' question, which I find is a very interesting question. And you know, his question was really about if you want building technique, material, technology, and I think Berend has given a very interesting response to that. But I would even widen the question also to, you know, the design intent. An architect working on a restoration of a building is obviously going to try to understand as good as possible what the original design intent was, and then you can hear me. I see the connection is unstable.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, it's to be as sympathetic and as intelligent and as sensitive as possible to the design intent, but then there lies a huge responsibility and a huge sort of I would say balancing act in now bringing this building that was maybe designed in the 1960s into our times. I thought it was very interesting in the presentations today, this whole idea around, you know, I don't think we should be doing heritage preservation for the sake of it and for sort of having kind of museum objects in the city. I think that, you know, they also be quite of nice, you know, it's nice to live around sort of nice objects, but what we really want these buildings to be is relevant for today way or form, whether it is for the community or whether it is commercial or whether it is for the city in a wider scale. And I find it, you know, as an architect, I think it is I find it a huge responsibility and challenge to bring this building into today and make it relevant for these kind of scenarios, and at the same time understand and respect the original design intent. So mine is not really a question, I must say, it's actually more like a statement that I made that sort of James brought me to. And really, I just as a general statement, I wanted to say that I'm hugely inspired by much of what I learned tonight. And of course, I keep thinking, what can Kampala learn from that? What can this happen in Kampala? I think many of the listeners will have that thought in their mind, because we've gotten used to this idea that in Kampala there is no conservation. In Kampala we just demolish our stuff. We stick aluminium to the front of it if necessary, if we can't afford demolition. So so there's very little belief in I think in the public that Kampala can actually have such examples as well. So of course, if Local Talks, if this little event, if the conservation management plan of the Ugandan Museum, if such initiatives could somehow contribute to a stronger belief and to hopefully some real actions in that direction, then that would be really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. Thanks for that comment. I'm just going to have one more question from Canon. So I'm just going to unmute him now to ask the question himself.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. This was a very nice presentation. My question, or my just to add to what architect Felix Holland said, we are looking at cultural heritage, but I think also relevance to the situation today is also very important. And also, I think as architects, we should also think of maybe cultural restoration in maybe the new, or even if we are doing, even if we are restoring some old buildings, I think also in terms of to revive the cultural significance of like the society or the people around the area is also very, very important. And also I know that especially here in Uganda, there are some cultural norms that have been lost in time that maybe might need to kind of be restored in order to just to restore those cultural norms and maybe the building styles, the building materials. So basically that is what I have to add to to this topic. And that was my view about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenan, for your contribution. I saw there's a question that was missed earlier from Anna. I don't know if she'd like to ask the question. If you'd like to ask the question yourself, Anna, or if I should just. It's an interesting question. Yeah, I'll just read the question, and it's for any panelist. She says, are there examples of changes in building code regulation that help incentivize preservation over demolition and rebuilding in East Africa or elsewhere? I guess that's
maybe I can answer that, Randy.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Maybe to just sum up a few things, conservation is not about stopping development. It is about controlling development for posterity. Yes, conservation has different aspects of building code and regulations. And if I give you my case of Lamu and Mombasa, we had to enact laws, and we call them conservation bylaws. And these laws are vested in the local councils. Somebody asked about the participation of local councils. Participation of local council is mostly about legislation because they are very they're very strong legislative bodies rather than National Museums of Kenya. For in the example of Kenya, the National Museums of Kenya actually was to provide the expertise and the finances. And Berend, this will interest you most because the conservation started with the Dutch government in Kenya. It's the Dutch government that started this conservation program. Anyway, to go directly to Anna's question, we had to enact conservation bylaws in Mombasa and in Lamu. And these bylaws talked about materials to be used, the the facades to be put up, the height of the buildings, the techniques, and all these issues. So there is a special conservation bylaw in Kenya, in Lamu, and in Mombasa to control development. As I said, not to stop development, but to control. I think our idea is not to romanticize, if there's a word like that, to romanticize historic towns and to turn them into open air museums. Development will always be there, but we need to control development. So these bylaws are there. And yes, it is expensive to do conservation. It's probably twice as much expensive, or even 3 times as much expensive to do that. But in Kenya, we did start what we call Conservation Trust Fund, where we helped owners to restore their buildings. We gave about 75% of the total restoration cost, and the owners had to pay 25%, and we restored about 7 buildings in Mombasa and about 22 buildings in Lamu. It is cheaper to restore in Lamu than in Mombasa. But basically, these funds were sinking funds. It was not a revolving fund because these are donor-funded projects. Governments, East African governments, I'm sure they do not have a lot of money to do conservation. So we have to approach institutions like Getty Conservation Trust and many other UNESCO and other bodies. So it is expensive, but we also, what we did in Kenya and Mombasa, we talked to the councils so that the owners could get a rebate, a discount of 50% for the land rates. So owners within the historic towns of Lamu and Mombasa are supposed to pay 50% of the land rates. That was the idea, but I don't think that has been followed because of political issues and many other issues. I don't know if I've answered well your question, Anna. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, I guess there's a comment that can be read, but I think it's time to close down. We have a few minutes till before the close of this event. I don't want there to be an abrupt stop with the questions, and so I'll just say that essentially, if there are questions or comments hanging, that these can, we will share this with the panelists so that the conversation can continue after this session. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining, to the attendees and to the speakers and the panelists here. It has been really inspiring, I think, definitely, especially for, I think, as Felix was saying, being in Kampala and thinking about these examples elsewhere, Netherlands, in Mombasa, in Tanzania. I think it's just interesting to see the wide perspective of heritage and what could potentially happen. And so I hope it's been encouraging for many of us to hear. The next Local Talks, we do continue to have other Local Talks events. It will be on a different topic, and we have them every 3rd Wednesday of every 3rd month. So the next one will be in December. And please feel free to get in touch with us if you have topics that you are interested in or expert in a particular field that is relevant to these discussions. And yeah, we hope to hear from you, and we hope that you will continue to join us and join this forum. Yeah, I think that's all from us, and I'll follow up with the recording of this event will also be made available. So if you want to share, if you've missed it, you are welcome to listen again at a later point. But yeah, thank you again. Special thanks to all the panelists here and the attendees. Okay. Good night.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye.